My name is Muir, and well, there's actually something that I want to check out real quick. We haven't done anything like this yet on the channel, but figure it might be something that could be fun for us. And that is, let's do a quick reaction video, because I'm trying to figure out if I want to play the Gunbreaker or the Paladin. Let's go ahead and do that. There we go.
Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here and welcome to Final Fantasy Versus. This series is dedicated towards discussing the pros and cons of each job within each role in Final Fantasy XIV. This video is actually a reissue of my tank versus from July of last year. There have been some pretty big changes to tanks since then, most notably with Paladin's complete rework in patch 6.3. So while most of this video will remain the same, I want to update it to match the current state of the role here at about the halfway point of Endwalker. Might do this with a few other roles as well. That being said, if there's a specific tank that you want to check out, be sure to use the timestamps in the description. Before we talk about the tanks, let me tell you about this video's sponsor, HelloFresh. If you've never heard of them, HelloFresh delivers pre-portioned, fresh ingredients right to your door with seasonal recipes to boot. I started using them 3 years ago, long before it was sponsored, in order to save money because I just didn't want to order takeout all the time anymore. I not only saved money using HelloFresh, but I also learned some basic cooking skills, which have been useful for the years since then. So, all in all, a win-win. So if you're interested, you can try out HelloFresh by using the link in the description and using code POGHF92227 to get a big discount and free shipping when you use the link. Hey, that discount code might be a mouthful, but so is HelloFresh. Trust me on that one. Anyway, thanks again to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video, and with that, let's get to it. First up, let's start with the traditional sword and board tank, Paladin. As one of the two OG tanks for Final Fantasy XIV, the job has seen some weird ups and downs across its time. However, it hit a really good stride in the last couple of expansions as it's moved further and further into this holy sword summoning machine. Bringing a mix of physical and magical attacks has given it versatility and a fantastic looking set of skills to match. It was also reworked in patch 6.3 like I mentioned at the start of the video, so how is Paladin faring against the competition now? I'd say it's faring quite well. The rework has brought more consistency to the rotation and even given them some new defensive capabilities to boot. The flow of the job is quite simple. Most of the time you perform your Royal Authority combo, which then grants access to 3 stacks of Sword Oath. You'll expend those on the Atonement skill, so you're basically doing 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, 4, and you just flow through that over and over again. Royal Authority also grants the Paladin Divine Might, which allows them to use one of their offensive magic skills with no cast time and increased damage. Whether it be Holy Spirit for single target or Holy Circle for AoE, this gives them some added flexibility to save this Divine Might, maybe to use it for a short downtime phase in the next few GCDs, or even for burst window optimization. Once a minute, Paladin slings out a ton of skills to deal a bunch of burst damage on the opponent. Fight or Flight now increases all damage the Paladin does for 20 seconds, meaning it is used in conjunction with their magic skills to grant much higher upfront damage. On top of that, Goring Blade now acts as a single high-potency GCD you can use once a minute, so these two skills are pretty much always used in conjunction with each other. After activating Fight or Flight, you can also activate Requiescat. Technically, you could do it without Fight or Flight, but you probably don't want to. You want that bonus damage. This deals a ton of damage up front and grants the Paladin a boost to their magic skills for a short time. It also grants access to Confiteor, a massive AoE sword that impales all in its path. This then transforms into a Blade Magic combo, Blade of Faith, Blade of Truth, and Blade of Valor. These 3 GCDs do even more AoE damage, so you'll pretty much always be using Goring Blade and the entire 4 buttons after Requiescat every minute. This leaves the Paladin with 3 extra global cooldowns to use during their burst window, and while you can optimize these to their absolute peak, it's considered not really worth the effort. There's an improvement to be made, but not anything that's worth stressing over. You'll of course want to save a Divine Might at the minimum, but it's nice to see Paladin have this flexible burst window. They can enter it at any global cooldown and have 3 whole global cooldowns to flex inside of it. It's quite cozy. Paladin does still have some damaging off globals to consider as well, though it's mostly about using them efficiently or during raid buffs. Circle of Scorn deals AoE damage and places a dot on all nearby enemies as it has since the beginning of time, while Expiation deals AoE damage around the target. You also get 2 stacks of Intervene, a gap closer that deals a bit of damage. You can use these during burst, and in the case where you can save them for that, that's what you'll want to do. But if you need them for their movement aspect instead for a specific mechanic, be sure to save one. They of course have a basic AoE combo should the need arise, and they even have Shield Bash, a long duration stun that's on the global cooldown. It only sees use in niche situations, but can be a great tool to bring forth when needed in addition to their roll action stun. Speaking of niche situations, they also have a spell called Clemency. This is a heal they can cast on themselves or allies, and they even get 50% of the heal value back when they use it on another player. You don't want to sit there and pretend to be a healer. This is really only for emergency situations, but when you do have a use for it, you will be very glad that you had it. The rest of their tools are defensive. First, their Oath Gauge grants access to a few defensive skills, each costing 50 gauge. You get a little bit of gauge every time you auto attack too, so you can pretty well time out when you'll actually have the gauge available. Holy Sheltron grants them damage reduction and some healing over time, while also granting increased damage reduction for the first few seconds. Intervention instead throws a slightly weaker version of these effects at a target teammate, enhanced further if you have any other defensive skills up at the time. Great for assisting your second tank or even teammates that are being targeted by specific attacks. They can also use cover for 50 gauge, which causes them to take all the damage of their covered target while in range. However, this skill has seen reduced use outside of very specific circumstances, so the other two are much more frequently used than this. Now we can just rattle off a few of their remaining defensive skills. Sentinel reduces incoming damage by 30%, Divine Veil, which was reworked in 6.3 slightly, provides a shield to the Paladin and their teammates, even restoring a bit of health. And yes, it applies that shield instantly now. Passage of Arms gives the Paladin 100% block rate and reduces the damage of any teammates in the wings behind them by 15%. The skill is channeled though, so using any other action will interrupt it. Fortunately, by just popping it for a second, you can actually give your teammates the damage reduction for about 5 seconds, so it does have some flexible use. Speaking of blocking, Paladin saw the return of an old defensive cooldown in patch 6.3, Bulwark. This increases their block chance by 100% for 10 seconds. So yeah, you'll just be blocking for a while. Finally, Hallowed Ground makes the Paladin completely invincible to almost any attack for 10 seconds. All insanely useful skills that you'll definitely need to learn to use. Now for the pros, Paladin fits the traditional tank image, making it appealing to players who want to look like a holy protector. Job fantasy can be really important, and especially among the tanks, this one looks the most like a tank. It has a simple to understand flow with some room to min-max, lots of ranged attacks, and even a direct heal for their teammates. Don't be shy trying to save something with Clemency, even if it isn't really what you're supposed to do when you're being quote-unquote optimal. And the sustain they have naturally during their magic phase combined with Holy Sheltron can really let themselves, well, pull themselves through situations for more dangerous attacks or big dungeon pulls. For the cons though, it's gonna be a lot about how you feel about Paladin post 6.3 rework. In the old tank verses, I said they had poor burst, they were awkward to min-max, and weren't as defensive. Pretty much all of those things have been remedied, minus the extreme lengths you can go to squeeze out those couple of extra points of damage. However, players are divided on the feel. What it gained in functionality, it lost in uniqueness, and to some, that's not really acceptable. Others find that its newer, simple route, where you don't have to do all the crazy stuff to play it properly, is, well, better, but it's going to depend on every person you ask.
So this is actually something that's kind of important. So the general trend over time has been that stuff generally is easier to play. So, like, just think about you want. So in the video, he's talking about how there's a little bit more you can squeeze out of the job. So that's really important, because that's what you'll be doing in like ultimates, savages and ultimates. What is it? Savage, and I think it's Savage then Ultimate. I could be wrong. I haven't gotten that far. But whichever one of those is the highest, that's when, well, both of those, you'll be doing that in. And so that's where you'll have this super high end or the super high ceiling where you need to be doing all this weird stuff to get out just every sliver, every ounce every I don't know milliliter of damage, every micrometer, every microliter of damage to just so you guys can not die to the enraged check at 1%. So that's where that will come into play, and that's where, like, really that's what people will care about. But unless you're doing like world first stuff, you don't need to really worry about that too much. The other thing is, so as I said, the trend is towards simplification. You generally want classes to be easy enough for someone brand new to the genre, or even brand new to gaming, to pick it up and be able to keep up with the class. So if like somebody's 70 and they're playing video games the first time ever, I don't know, their grandkids want them to play them or something, or they heard this game was cool, and they're playing it. What you want is for them to be able to pick up a class. Let's say they want to be a tank because they like the tank fantasy, they like the paladin fantasy or something. You want them to be able to pick that up and play it. You don't want them to pick it up, get completely overwhelmed, and not be able to play the game at all, because then because that would just breed elitism. And well, we can sort of see how that works out in World of Warcraft, uh, where people are incredibly toxic because of the elitism. And then in FF14, I don't know, 90, 95, 99% of the entire, like, player base is not that. And then you have, like, this 1% that isn't even as bad as WoW is, but is just, we need to just do it. You need to do it better. You need to just keep on everything. And they're the ones who want all this high complexity, because the higher the skill ceiling is, generally with perfect play, the better overall something is. And if we look at, say, tank parses, we see Gunbreaker has like insane damage, right? Let's see. I remember looking into this at some point. What was it? This one? Yeah. So if we look at this one, for example, so what we see is like Warriors the lowest, but they can kind of heal themselves pretty well right now, and then Paladins right after them, and then you have Dark Knight, and then you have Gunbreaker. This right here is probably near perfect play. Same thing with this one, same thing with this one, and same thing with this one. Like, these are so ungodly rare to see that you might as well not even aspire to this. Most players will be, the vast majority of people are in that big red bar here. Then you have more of your outliers over here, these thinner bars, and then you have like the literal highest one. So what that means is, when we look at this graph, what we can gather from here is, if you are doing like world first raids, you're gonna want probably 2 Gunbreakers. But this is very important. None of that matters. None of that matters at all to the vast majority of players. Hello, new viewer. None of that matters to the vast majority of players. Most people, by the time they get to the content has been solved, and they're able to play the content essentially how it was intended to be played, instead of needing to do these hyper optimal ways of playing the game. And Square Enix, Yoshi P and them, they don't want you to have to, they don't want to force players to do a certain class, tank, healer combination. Like, if you want to have 2 shield heroes, go for it. You want to have 2 paladins, go for it. You want to have all archers for some reason, go for it. I don't know why you would, but hey, maybe just your team really likes archers. Maybe you have a bunch of people who want to play Legolas, a bunch of people who want to play some Paladin, and a bunch of people who really, really, really like academics. Sounds good. But that composition could do it. Like if you took the lowest DPS of the DPSs, the worst tank and the worst healers, they should, with enough practice, be able to clear all content in the game. So those graphs really aren't that important unless you're doing world first content.
That's not to say it doesn't have any direct cons. It's not all feel. It's the lowest DPS tank, even if by a small margin. It also has the longest tank invulnerability cooldown, despite other skills seeing significant buffs over the years. I don't know.
Let's check that, by the way, because we have this for right now. So if we look at the average, let's look at the median. So for the Paladin, the median is 50. Let's say it's 50. Let's say 50.5. Let's look at Gunbreaker. That's 53.38. So these numbers are not far from each other. Now, just for comparison, let's go with all jobs. So we have the healers are down here, right? You have Astrologian, Scholar, White Mage. Where's Sage on this? It'd be crazy if it was up here, like everybody would just play Sage. Is Sage even on here? Yeah, it is. Weird. Oh, okay, it just has nothing. Okay, sounds good. What is this on anyway? Eden's Prawns? Oh well, it doesn't matter. This is probably for like current patch, isn't it? How do I get how do I get to the other one? I literally don't know how to use this. It's funny. I don't know. Endwalker. Yes. I don't know any of these. Anyway, let's go back to where we were. There we go. Whatever. We'll just assume that Sage is also around here. So we have White Mage does the most damage, Scholar does the second most damage. Sage is probably around here, I guess. I'd have no idea. But what we see is these support non-DPS classes tend to do sub 60. And then you have these, and you have the DPS classes that all do over 60, and we have Dancer doesn't do that much, and then you have Samurai does the most. But again, this is going to be looking at stuff with like perfect play, and that's just not all that realistic. So if we were to look at the ranged DPSs, like these two are pretty low, that just might be there aren't a lot of parses, and then everything else is sort of in this area. We have the melee DPS is there and here and there. So we'll go with this one and say that is 83.24, and that's 90. It's not going to make a massive difference. Unlike going from, say, here to, like, there. But this one, I'm guessing this graph isn't adding in all the benefits that this person can give, say, this person, to boost their overall DPS up. So lowest damage of all the tanks is like slight. So it's not really that big of a deal.
I don't know why this is still 7 minutes. That being said, the job's actual effectiveness is not to be called into question. It's a classic and safe choice for any player, especially post 6.3. Now for OG tank number 2, Warrior. This job has also had quite the journey through the years. It started as arguably useless all the way back in 2.0, but since 2.1 has gradually improved and moved into this berserker tank fantasy. Not only do they have great defensive capabilities, but they also rip through enemies with massively powerful strikes, big numbers, big hits, you know what it is. This has been true for quite some expansions, but is that enough in Endwalker? Well, I'd say it's doing more than enough. Warrior is super popular thanks to its ease of play and its powerful job fantasy. During a fight, it first wants to make sure it's maintaining its Surging Tempest buff, granting it increased damage. So long as this is up, they shift over to prioritizing their beast gauge, which they want to generate in order to unleash powerful attacks. Cleave is a powerful single target attack, and Decimate is a powerful AoE attack.
Okay, so what I'm getting from this is that in 2.0, most likely, Paladin was the defensive tank, and then Warrior was the offensive tank. Think Dungeons and Dragons, you have your fighter who specializes in, say, defense, and he's going like power shield and heavy armor and all this stuff, and specializing in using his shield, so he's really hard to hurt, really hard to hit. And then a barbarian as your tank on the other end of the spectrum, who just has a bunch of hit points and well, gets hit all the time. I'm guessing that's sort of what they were going for, and then they realized that the warrior needed more, but that was like 2.0, so 2.1 they changed it, so that's good.
Now, by using another skill, Infuriate, they instantly gain 50 Beast Gauge and transform these skills into more powerful versions, Inner Chaos for Cleave and Chaotic Cyclone for Decimate. These skills will also automatically critically direct hit, so there's always going to be big numbers associated with them. All of these skills also reduce Infuriate's cooldown, which lets you keep the numbers pumping. Now, once a minute, warriors can enter Inner Release, and this is synonymous with their job fantasy. This reduces the cost of their next 3 Beast Gauge skills to 0 and ensures that they critically direct hit. It also grants access to Primal Rend, a massive AoE gap closer that also critically direct hits. They also can't be knocked back or CC'd for the most part during this, which is really awesome sometimes, and sometimes can actually screw the mechanics up, so be a little bit careful with the timing. This Inner Release window and Infuriate are both part of their big damage burst, but ensure to never use Infuriate while under Inner Release. It's basically wasting a critical direct hit since you're already going to get that under Inner Release anyway. Now, between this, they do have some off globals to use. Upheaval and Orogeny are just single target and AoE OGCDs respectively, but ones that actually share a cooldown. Onslaught is a gap closer with 3 hole charges, something that only Warrior gets with its gap closer, and you can use those for damage or save them for movement reliant mechanics. They also of course have an AoE combo, but that's run of the mill stuff. Now, as for defensive capabilities, Warrior is absolutely stacked. Thrill of Battle increases max HP and heals them for the same amount, while also increasing healing the Warrior receives for its duration. Vengeance reduces damage by 30% and even deals damage back to enemies that strike them while they're under the effect. Equilibrium restores a large chunk of health and even heals the warrior over time for a short period after. Shake It Off is a party-wide shield that also heals everyone it hits, and you can even make it stronger by sacrificing your other defensive buffs for more powerful team AoEs. However, I think the cooldown that most people know Warrior best for is Bloodwetting. This reduces incoming damage, grants a small HP shield to the warrior, and allows the warrior to heal for every enemy they hit with a weapon skill for a short duration. The damage reduction is also even greater for the first few seconds. This skill can single-handedly allow warriors to survive even the most absurd situations, as the healing is nigh unmatched in AoE packs and consistently present in single target encounters. You can even give a lot of these effects to a nearby party member by using Nascent Flash. This ability shares a cooldown with Bloodwetting, but is more apt for situations where you just don't need all of those effects on yourself and somebody else would benefit from them more. But even more importantly, if you land weapon skills with Nascent Flash, you'll actually heal not only yourself as the warrior, but also the teammate you've given that effect to. So it's just such an insanely strong skill. So it doesn't matter that they share a cooldown because they're just that good. You just have to use the right one at the right time. Finally, they have their tank invulnerability skill, Holmgang. This prevents the warrior from falling below 1 HP for 10 seconds to most attacks, and even binds weaker enemies in place. While you still take damage during this skill, the inability to die is key here. So long as you don't die right after the 10 seconds have passed, you just have 10 seconds of not being able to die. That is pretty much as good as anything's gonna be for an invulnerability skill. Not to mention, the skill actually has a pretty short cooldown of only 4 minutes, so it can be used a lot in longer encounters to skip or abuse lots of tank mechanics or specific other attacks as well. So the pros for Warrior. The biggest pro is that it's super easy to pick up and play. If you've never tanked, this is probably your best pick. Its burst damage is insanely high, and its job fantasy makes you feel really strong during those 1-minute burst windows. These strict burst timings also give them an edge in fights with long downtime phases, essentially allowing them to chain them back to back when the boss is available. Not to mention their sustain and defensive capabilities make them one of the best actual tanks in the game, this whole berserker fantasy aside. For the cons, it's really just preferential. Really all I can say is that some people find it boring. It is a really simple and static rotation, focusing on the dopamine dose of big hits, but not being as engaging as some of the other tanks. It also used to have lower DPS than the other tanks. However, after repeated potency buffs in patch 6.2 and 6.21, it really propelled it upwards. So the job just kind of has no real weaknesses anymore. I guess a bad kill time can affect its aggregate performance, but that's just being peckish. It's not a flavor for everyone, but Warrior is certainly an easy choice in terms of both output and difficulty. Now onto one of our newer options, let's check out Dark Knight. I say newer despite Dark Knight's introduction in...
You know, one of the things I like about Warrior there is the ability to just do consistent damage to enemies, like their ability to strike back enemies with one of their abilities. Yeah, they also just the whole their hit points will hit 1, but they won't die. They're just filled with so much piss and vinegar and rage. You cannot kill them. They don't use some sort of deific veil. They don't use anything like that. Instead, they're just like, the enemy says die, and they go, no! And that's it. They just gnash their teeth and keep fighting. All their organs are on the ground, like all of them, putting their heart, and they just sort of like grab them all, you know, dirt and blood and gore and stuff, and like shove them back into their into their torso, and sort of just like take some duct tape and keep fighting. It's pretty funny.
3.0, just an expansion later, but it's been so constantly poked and prodded and adjusted that it might as well be unidentifiable to what it was back then. Despite this, it maintains some of its identity as a busy, high-bursting tank with a big sword. Does that stack up against what our other tanks bring to the table, though? Let me tell you, it sure does. Dark Knight may be criticized for its design over the years, but its performance in high-end content speaks for itself. A main portion of its job identity that it's maintained is its ability to use its MP to provide a number of effects. Nowadays, it's used for some damage and defensive tools. On top of that, it does have another resource called Blood, which will also allow them to execute specific attacks. For the cost of 3000 MP, they can use one of 3 skills: Edge of Shadow for big single target damage, Flood of Shadow for big AoE damage, and the Blackest Night, a large max health shield that can be placed on any party member for a short time. The shield being broken grants the Dark Knight the Dark Arts effect, making the next Edge or Flood free. It is essential that anytime you use the Blackest Night that it is broken, because otherwise you do suffer a DPS loss. Edge and Flood also grant the Dark Knight bonus damage for a time, so using them just enough to maintain that buff, but not too much that you can't utilize the Blackest Night when you need it, or deal lots of damage in burst windows is essential. They also gain Blood as they use their basic combos and abilities. For the cost of 50 Blood, they can use Blood Spiller for single target damage, Quietus for AoE damage, or Living Shadow. The Living Shadow summons a dark clone of a familiar Dark Knight NPC to automatically attack your opponent. This is a long cooldown, so you'll be using it as part of your 2-minute burst windows. Now they do have even more attacks to assist their damage and utility as well. Plunge is their gap closer that holds up to 2 charges. Salted Earth is an AoE that Dark Knights drop at their feet that deals damage to anything standing in it over time. You can also execute Salt and Darkness at the higher levels, causing a highly damaging AoE explosion from within your Salted Earth. Then you have Carven Spit and Abyssal Drain, two skills that share a cooldown. Carve and Spit deals high off-global damage to a single target and restores some MP, while Abyssal Drain deals AoE damage, restores MP, and even restores HP for each target hit. Abyssal Drain is best used on large groups of enemies, otherwise you'll be using Carve and Spit mostly. Their final attack skill is Shadowbringer, fitting right, which deals huge off-global damage. It stores up to 2 charges at 60 seconds a charge, so saving up 2 of them for your big 2-minute burst window is a frequently used plan. However, a charge can be used early if a fight mechanic dictates its necessity, such as bursting something with really low HP. Now, while those are all of the job's attacks, it also has cooldowns in addition to those attacks. Blood Weapon grants 5 stacks of the Blood Weapon buff. Each weapon skill or spell used consumes a stack and restores some MP and grants some blood. With a 60-second cooldown, it becomes a big part of their 1 and 2 minute burst windows, especially for that bonus MP and blood. Finally, they have Delirium. This causes the next 3 Blood Spiller or Quietus uses to cost no blood and also restore some MP. Also with a 2-minute cooldown, you can see why the job is so busy and powerful during its burst windows. Oh right, by the way, this job is a tank, yeah? Well, let's see what tank skills it has too, I suppose. Shadow Wall reduces damage taken by 30% for a short time. Dark Mind reduces magic damage taken by 20% for a short time. Oblation is a 10% damage reduction skill you can use either on yourself or a party member. It even has 2 charges with a 60-second charge time. Then there's Dark Missionary, which reduces magic damage taken by the party for a short time by 10%. We already mentioned the Blackest Night, so let's move over to another really big skill for them, Living Dead. This is their tank invulnerability equivalent, and it is one that has been a roller coaster of emotion. Upon activation, the Dark Knight is granted Living Dead for 10 seconds. Now this buff does nothing by itself, but if the Dark Knight takes lethal damage during that time, it will trigger the Walking Dead effect and preserve their life for 10 seconds after. However, if the Dark Knight isn't healed for an amount equal to 100% of their max health in that 10-second window, they will die. Fortunately, nowadays, Dark Knight actually heals themselves with their own global cooldowns once Walking Dead is procced, something that is much newer for the job. They can heal themselves to full off this most of the time, but if Walking Dead was triggered on a bad GCD timing, then you might need like an OGCD from a healer in order to ensure safety. So for the pros, the job's burst damage is insanely high. While this tapers off between burst windows, you will feel very powerful during this time, even more so in encounters with lots of downtime. It's also insanely busy during burst windows, in exchange for being semi-calm between them. It has quite a few unique tools for reducing magic damage, a very potent shield in that of the Blackest Night, and an overall solid array of defensive and offensive skills. It truly does feel like a DPS that they just decided to make a tank, as most people would often say with Dark Knight as a whole. The cons, on the other hand, are noticeable as well. For one, it's so busy during burst windows that if you have to do any tank-related responsibilities during that time, it can be a hassle. Whether it's using a tank cooldown or repositioning, just expect pain. Also, having magic-only defensive tools can leave you sometimes feeling vulnerable to certain bosses that use less magical skills. They've gotten a lot better about making most bosses use magical skills in recent times, but a pure physical boss sometimes slips through now and again. And of course, the most noticeable con is their lack of health sustain. Their 1-2-3 combo has a bit of healing off the 3rd skill, as does Abyssal Drain, but that's pretty much it. This makes them have to mitigate much smarter, especially in more casual content like dungeons, whereas you'll see Warrior practically solo heal themselves and maybe even somebody else if they're timing their skills correctly. The other 2 tanks also do a pretty good job of sustaining, so it really just leaves Dark Knight hanging dry. Despite some pretty obvious flaws though, the job frequents endgame raids and is considered a powerhouse in endgame content. Finally, we come to the most recent tank on the list, Gunbreaker.
Yeah, the Dark Knight sounds really fun. It's that huge, insane burst window that will make them really desirable, especially in like world first content. But let's talk a little bit about that. Why? So in high-end raiding content, there's something to understand about bosses, and that is that bosses, when you start a fight with a boss in FF14, you are essentially on a race. and you're racing towards the end of the fight. Now, when you hit the end of the fight, one of two things is going to happen. Well, when you hit the end of the boss's overall timer, one of two things is going to happen. The boss is going to die, or the boss is going to hit their enrage timer at the very end that basically says, you don't have enough DPS or you weren't fast enough to kill this boss. So now this boss is going to start AoEing the entire party down and just kill the group. So I've heard about this. I haven't seen it in this game yet. Basically, they just start doing stuff that hits the entire arena over and over and over and over and over until everyone dies. And healers can sort of fight that a little bit. They can fight that for a short amount of time, but it's not gonna. They're not gonna be able to fight it for forever. It's just not really realistic for them. So having really high burst windows, having really high damage is actually kind of important. Now, as I said, you could have the lowest DPS party, you should be able to clear all content. It'll just be about optimizing everyone and what they need to be doing. So, I would suspect that a lot of world first raiders either have 2 gunbreakers or a Dark Knight and a gunbreaker. I suspect that's what they have. I have not seen any of their videos, but that's what I suspect is probably happening. Because I've heard that, because Gunbreaker has the highest DPS, followed by Dark Knight. Yeah. As you can see when we look at this graph, we have Gunbreaker, then we have Dark Knight, and their DPS is really close to each other, and then we have Paladin and Warrior. So, and it looks like the sheer amount of sustain that Warrior gets has now like lowered his overall DPS. But yeah, typically what you will find is high risk typically gives you more DPS. That tends to be the trend. So that what that would tell me is that Gunbreaker probably has the least amount of overall defense. Dark Knight has a little bit of extra defense over something else. Then Paladin has the most like defense, but all of their healing and sustain is going to be like spells. It's going to be like casting Clemency on yourself if you need that. And then Warrior, just by virtue of being a warrior, heals themselves. By virtue of being so angry, they will never die. They're able to do all kinds of things. So that's what I think is gonna. I think that's what we're gonna see here. Is you have the Dark Knight for bosses that use magic. You have a Gunbreaker for bosses that do physical damage. And yeah, if the problem becomes instead that your tanks are just dying all the time, and you guys just cannot do anything to keep your tanks alive for whatever reason, then somebody brings a Paladin. Or somebody brings a warrior. Maybe you bring in a warrior and a paladin just so you can survive long enough to hit the late game, to hit the later parts of the raid boss.
The job was added in Shadowbringers and joins Dark Knight in the "oh right, I'm playing a tank" category. Tons of fast hitting attacks and big damage is the name of the game. In Endwalker, they basically handed them a few more attacks and said, "go get him, Tiger." But does that let it stand alongside the other tanks? I'd say it does more than that. Gunbreaker has been in an incredible spot since implementation, even if the busyness can definitely be a bit much. The job's basic combos, both single target and AoE, grant them cartridges up to a max of 3, which can then be spent on some skills. The two basics are Burst Strike and Faded Circle, single target and AoE attacks respectively. They also have Gnashing Fang, which kicks off a high damage 3-part combo that is synonymous with their identity. Finally is their new skill, Double Down, which uses 2 cartridges to deal massive AoE damage once every 2 minutes. Managing these for burst windows is essential, with Bloodfest also helping out. What does Bloodfest do, you might ask? Well, Bloodfest allows you to draw 3 cartridges instantly, so the number of bonus attacks it helps pull off during burst windows is very valuable. Now, these cartridges are only half of their main identity.
This was actually something I noticed when I was sort of setting up my gunbreaker. If we go and look at our gunbreaker, I wouldn't set down everything. When I get to where I'm able to actually use everything again, where I'm actually able to like use everything, then we'll see how that goes as it develops. But yeah, it definitely seems like this is a tank that, as far as I can tell, is dedicated to just doing absolutely enormous amounts of damage incredibly quickly. Of course, this will move around as I actually use the abilities and figure out how everything works. But it is what it is.
The other half is their single skill continuation. This off-global attack grants access to a number of bonus attacks during your Gnashing Fang combo, with each attack in that combo granting another use of continuation. This ensures at minimum 6 button presses during each of your cartridge combos, not to mention any other offensive or defensive skills you may need to activate. Continuation even adds an off-global attack to Burst Strike nowadays, increasing the number of things you need to press during your burst windows by another button. Now, on top of all of that, they do have some other damaging skills. Sonic Break is a global cooldown attack that inflicts a damage over time once every 60 seconds. Bow Shock is an AoE off-global damage over time skill once a minute. Rough Divide is their gap closer with up to 2 charges, standard stuff. And Blasting Zone is an off-global, very high damage attack. Between all of these things, your 60 and 120 second burst windows get just so busy. They even have No Mercy, a buff with a 60 second cooldown that increases their damage dealt by 20%. Even with it lasting 20 seconds, Gunbreakers can't even fit all of their damage into this window comfortably in their 2-minute reopeners. It's just that busy. Fortunately, they do also tank bosses, and they have some skills to do that, believe it or not. For just themselves, Camouflage reduces their damage taken by 10% and increases their parry rate by 50% for a short time, and Nebula reduces their damage taken by 30%. The rest of their defensive skills can be used on themselves, allies, or the whole party at once. Heart of Light reduces the party's magic damage taken by 10%, and Aurora is a regen that you can place on yourself or an ally. It has 2 charges with a 60-second recharge time as well. Then comes Heart of Corundum. Similar to certain other tank skills, this effect grants the target, whether that be the Gunbreaker or target party member, a number of effects. It reduces damage taken for a short time, with this effect intensified for the first few seconds of the buff. It also grants the player Catharsis of Corundum, which will provide a burst of healing if the player falls below 50% health or automatically after 20 seconds of receiving the effect. Corundum even grants a small shield if the Gunbreaker themselves is under the effect of Brutal Shell, a small heal and shield that they get from the second weapon skill in their basic single target combo. Finally is their invuln skill, Super Bolide. This reduces the Gunbreaker's health to 1 and makes them impervious to most attacks for 10 seconds. It's basically Hallowed Ground, but you go to 1 HP. And that's all it is. There is sometimes a little bit of a bug where the delay between going to 1 health and becoming invincible can become noticeable, especially in higher pings, but that won't affect most people most of the time. It's just one of those things you just might notice if you play the job long enough. For pros and cons, it's going to sound a lot like Dark Knight. Pros, it's an adrenaline rush. There's tons of button to press. It's exciting. There's big damage, many endorphins, all that good stuff. It doesn't take away from its tanking capabilities either, so they're just fully capable jobs across the board. That's all there is to it. For cons, the job's busyness works against itself at times. Much like with Dark Knight, using defensive skills or dealing with boss movement during burst windows becomes incredibly cumbersome if they unfortunately line up. Now, the movement issue was somewhat mitigated, I'd say significantly mitigated, in patch 6.2, with the range increase on their continuation skills, but that doesn't account for the somewhat awkward feel of still doing both at the same time. And that's important for Gunbreaker, since continuation skills must be used before the next weapon skill is used or that extra ability is lost. Their AoE raidment is also strictly magic focused, meaning any physical AoEs are a little more troublesome to mitigate. And while their sustain is actually pretty strong, it's not quite at the level of Warrior or Paladin. It's not that far behind though. People really sleep on Heart of Corundum and how amazing it can be, but it requires a bit more of a finesse, a bit more of a special touch to make sure that it is used to its maximum. Despite those cons, Gunbreaker is often one of the more popular raid choices when people are looking to deal a lot of damage, even if that damage window isn't as significant as it used to be thanks to the buffs that Warrior got. Now that we've covered all 4 tanks, I need to pick a winner, and it's honestly really tough. The tanks really do come down to whether or not you want something super busy or something that's a little easier to play. Maybe you prefer a certain job fantasy, and that's really all the preference that it comes down to. But despite all of that, I really do want to pick a winner. And so I think that I'm going to give the win to Warrior. Yeah, I really want to give it to one of the other jobs, but it's not just about the unga bunga big damage in a release. It's the most approachable tank. It's one of the most defensive tanks. It's the highest sustained tank. And I don't care if its damage is 3% or 2% or 4% behind another tank in certain encounters, and all the tanks are so close, so I should pick the highest DPS option. There's just so many pros to this job, and the cons are more preferential than any of the other ones. Could it be more exciting of a job to play? Absolutely. Will a longtime tank prefer something else? Probably, but I'm going to give Warrior the win on the merits that I've listed. Honestly, that just makes 2nd through 4th nearly impossible. Paladin's gameplay has been streamlined and its defense is shored up, but its DPS just isn't quite up to 1st place's par. Then you have the other 2 tanks, Gunbreaker and Dark Knight, which their busyness, yeah, it can be exciting, but it can be such a nuisance when you're dealing with certain mechanics. So the cons are far more noticeable than Warrior. This kind of forces me to group them all up, or to decide to go in DPS order, in which case it would likely be Gunbreaker 2nd, Dark Knight 3rd, and Paladin 4th. But that just doesn't represent how the tank role works right now. It is just so close between them that you'll almost certainly see preference dictate choice. And
yeah, it's like, as I've said, unless you were looking at just like the tippity top of, you need to squeeze out every teeny tiny bit of extra DPS. Unless you are a world first raider, like it won't matter. But I do like his idea, because like the Warrior has the most sustain out of all the tank jobs. I mean, it can just heal itself to full by you can, with the Warrior you can heal yourself to full just by playing the game. Paladin, you have to cast spells or use items, so that is absolutely nuts. But yeah, being able to do high DPS, definitely there. It will help the group. That's the good part. But it also means your healer has to work harder. And the question really comes down, if you're looking at like extreme end optimization, you have to ask yourself, is it better for the tank to sort of be able to take care of themselves so the healer can DPS more? Or do you get more overall out of the tank? Wait, let me try this again. Do you get more out of the tank being able to DPS more, but the healer needing to heal more? Or do you get more out of the tank being able to sustain themselves for longer while the healer just DPSs? So, you know, you have those 2 options. So if you had, say, Warriors, you'd probably be able to sustain through everything. If you had, say, 2 Gunbreakers or a Gunbreaker and a Dark Knight, your healer would have to heal them more often. With the Dark Knight, if you don't heal them, they might just die. But after they use their ability, their tank ability, their invulnerability. But there's just so much, right? Like, they're so complex. And as you keep saying, they're very, very close to each other in terms of what they can do. So it just boils down to, what do you like playing? I mean, unless you're going to be world firsting, you're gonna world first, probably play Dark Knight or Gunbreaker, or play both of them, to where you can swap to whichever one you need. And you're static at that point. You'd know what your role is going to be. But I guess it's there. If you have shield heroes, go shield heroes. If you have shield healers, there we go. Raftalia is not going to like jump in. Wait, no, I mean that kind of works. We just don't have somebody who like transforms, right? Oh well. But if you have shield healers, then more than likely Gunbreaker and Dark Knight are probably better because the shield. If you're doing White Mage, you might be better off with Warrior, because you don't necessarily want as many shields, because he's going to be able to heal himself. I don't know. I'll be able to tell you more after I get them all to max level.
And not meta. And that's how it should be for all the roles. The tank role just needs some revitalization from a gameplay perspective, not from a balance perspective. So if anything, I just have to give the other 3 tanks, 2, 3, and 4 all together, throw them in a pool, and pick one out depending on which one you want to play. And with that, that's going to be a wrap for our Final Fantasy XIV Tank Versus. Thank you for being patient with this series. We've had so many other things going on the YouTube and Twitch channel, but I promised you I'd get you all of these, and I still plan to get them done before patch 6.2. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share, and I'll see you in the next video. Until then, take care.
Yeah, he does good videos. So yeah, when it comes down to it, all the tanks are viable. So it just depends on whatever your class fantasy is. Like, what do you want to be playing? How do you want to play? If you want a tank that is very easy to play, just go pick up the warrior and play that. I mean, you'll be healing yourself as you kill the enemy. If you want a tank that is more of a caster tank, then go with Paladin. If you want an edgy tank, go with a Dark Knight. And if you want the highest DPS tank, that's what you care about, then go with the Gunbreaker. But yeah, that's really the primary differences, that, as far as I understand them. My main was Paladin. We'll check out Dark Knight when I get there. I need to hit Heaven's Sword for that first. Then after that, we'll probably check out... I mean, we'll definitely level Gunbreaker too, because high DPS also makes just everything else easier as well. So, we'll see. Alright guys, I will catch you all later. Bye everyone.